You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. This is episode number 69, and I'm pleased to be talking with Jody Maberry today about ideas for becoming a silver entrepreneur. Again, on Leading the Factory Forward, our goal is to help you create a compelling future for yourself, your teams, and your organization. I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of each podcast episode and use that as a tool to capture notes as you start exploring the ideas in that episode. Or to help you get started on your journey in general and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. In this episode, I'm delighted to have Jody Maberry share his insights from his work with helping other entrepreneurs share their expertise and wisdom. So this would apply not only to individual entrepreneurs, but it also apply to manufacturing leaders of small companies who would like to share their message. So we'll cover with Jody, some of his work and his journey in his own words. And we'll talk about some key things, some key ideas. What's the mindset for an entrepreneur? How do you craft your value proposition using a podcast? The value of having a co-host in case you're new to podcasting and are nervous about getting started all by yourself. How to get comfortable with some of the technology. Jody will explain it and how it's used. We'll talk about a few specifics like the schedule and length of a show. So with that, we'll get right into our conversation with Jody. Well, welcome, Jody. And I want to thank you again for being here. And I guess we'd like to start out. My idea is to have you share your insights and experience and how you help other people share their expertise and wisdom. But to get going, I'd like you to share a little bit about your story and your journey.
Well, first, Lynn, let me just say it's a treat to be with you. I look back to when we first met. I'm gonna test your knowledge for a moment, Lynn. Then I'll get into my story. Where did we first meet?
I think it may have been at Ray Edwards' conference, but I'm not sure.
That's right. Yes. In San Diego, Lynn and I didn't know each other prior to this, but we happened to sit at the same table and have been friends ever since. So sometimes that's all it takes, saying hello to the person next to you.
Yeah.
And you make a friend that lasts for a long time. So that's fun to think back to that. We actually had a good table. That was a great conference, but our table, I think that's where all the superstars were.
Well, some of us were budding, but there was yourself and others I've stayed connected with over the years. It was a great group to go through that with.
Yeah, it certainly was. Well, when Lynn and I met at that conference in San Diego, I was still fairly new. That was only the second time I had been brave enough since I had started my own business to invest in going to a conference. And the first one was close. It was in Portland. I could drive down there. I took my whole family with me. We made a family trip out of it. And then I went to this conference on the side. That trip to San Diego was the first time I had invested in myself to go away somewhere. And I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't sure if it was going to be worth it. I was at the time tight with money thinking, is this good? And so I split a room with somebody. But that conference really turned things around. And this is all relevant to what we're going to talk about. That conference, not only did I learn a lot, but there were 5 people that I met at that conference that eventually hired me or we worked together in some way. One of them, David Hancock, we still do work together all this time later. And it was a great example of if I had said, gosh, I need to still hold back. I need to be a little conservative. I never would have went. And it made such a difference. So to get us to that point in San Diego, I moved out to Washington State after college. I'm a Midwestern boy, just like Lynn. I'm from Peoria, Illinois. But after college, I went on this big adventure and I saw so much that I just couldn't really return to Illinois. So I came back, I packed up all my stuff and I moved out to Washington State. I ended up being a financial analyst at a commercial bank, which is exactly what I went to college for. I thought that's exactly what I wanted to do. That lasted 4 years until I decided, all right, that's enough. I'm going to fulfill a boyhood dream and become a park ranger. And that took 1 year to make happen, where I would have to go to school at night because I couldn't let the job know what I was up to, because it was a really good place to work, but it was the type of environment that if you're not committed here, then you've got an important position. We'll find someone else that is committed. So school at night, work during the day, took a year, became a park ranger. And being a park ranger is as wonderful as you would imagine it to be. Unless you hate the outdoors, then it's probably just a terrible job. And I did that for 8 years. And when I left, I went back to school to get an MBA, and I worked for a luxury home builder doing marketing work for them. And after 2 years, I struck an agreement with them to leave, but still do my job, just no longer as their employee, which allowed me to get out on my own, which was good. And we continued to work together until this year, until 2020. So we worked together for many years. That's how I got out on my own. And I tried just local because I knew the construction industry and the trades from the job I had, but it wasn't taking off the way that I had hoped. I was starting to think, gosh, what do I do? And that's when I went to San Diego to try to learn at this conference. And I met Lynn, and your life changes after you meet Lynn. So that's how I got here out on my own. Now, on my own, I've had the real pleasure of working with a lot of former Disney people. And I think this is where it ties into what we're going to talk about today, is when you're from Disney, I'm going to use just Disney as an example. When you're from Disney, you know a lot of stuff, but it seems ordinary to you because you've been surrounded by it for years. You've been living it, breathing it, and it doesn't even seem remarkable. It just seems ordinary. But to the rest of the world, it's pretty spectacular. So that's where I come in, is I get to work with people like Lee Cockrell, who was the executive vice president of Walt Disney World. He ran the whole place for 10 years. And now I help him bring his story out and build his own personal brand. And I've found that for the most part, what works for Lee works for other people too. You don't have to be executive vice president of Walt Disney World. You just have to understand how to get out the right stories and get out what you know. And sometimes it takes help to realize the stuff that you think is ordinary and boring is pretty spectacular to somebody else. So that's where I come in. And that all started, I started to put those pieces together back in San Diego when I still have that notebook from, remember Lynn, they gave us the small moleskin notebooks. I still have that in my desk drawer.
Yeah. And it's, as we talk about people who want to, again, start their second act, and they don't have to have silver hair like me, but if they want to start their second act, it's a little different for them. And I have another friend that did a survey of some of the people he works with, and he said about 66% of the people are thinking of doing something like a podcast. He says, but they haven't made that next step. So I was wondering, the people you've worked with, think of some key ideas like, how did you help them sort through their mindset? Again, if I've been in the corporate world, my position is defined for me, my authority is defined for me, but now all of a sudden you're talking to a whole new audience. And how do you help them just kind of make that mental shift?
I think there's two shifts that need to take place. The first one is, let me use an example. I've done some calls with, he was a fairly high level state employee, so executive level state employee who spent his whole life in public service. And now that he retired, and he has to sell what he does, he was really struggling with it, because if you're in the public sector, your whole life is devoted to serving other people. And especially the job he had, you just don't brag about yourself. And he was having so much trouble with promoting because he felt like, well, that's not what I should do. I'm not supposed to talk myself. It's because he spent so long in the public sector that he just couldn't do it. And I said, listen, you can't help people if they don't know who you are. So yeah, I get it. You're trying to be humble. You're trying to be a servant, but you can't serve if there's no one in front of you that knows you can help them. So that's the first piece, is you have to get over yourself. And I'm from the Midwest, and I'm a middle child, and I know my granny wouldn't like me bragging on myself and promoting myself. And so I had to get over it too. But there's your first mindset shift. You have to be able to tell people what you do and how you can help them. So that takes us to the second one. Before I get into the second one, do you have anything to add on that first one, Lynn?
Well, I just think of, the other thing, I've helped some people in entrepreneurs and stuff. And one of the things myself and others, is the value proposition. Again, when I was in the corporate world, my position was my value proposition. Well, now it's not as easily defined. And yet I know along with this mindset, that's what you're helping people do.
Yes. And that is the second one, is that you have to figure out what it is that you do, that you offer that's different. You just have to be clear about it. Actually, you don't even have to be all that different. There's a lot of people that do what I do. There's a lot of people that do what Lynn does. You just have to be clear about it. This is what I do, and get yourself in front of the right people. So that's the piece, is understanding. I'm going to make this up, but let's say I had a 30-year career as an executive, or worked my way up to executive, all in the same industry. Let's just say all in manufacturing. And now what do I do? Because 30 years is a lot. There's so much knowledge in there. After 30 years in the same industry, you just have to realize and focus in on one thing. This is what I do. And in manufacturing, I'd kind of have to make it up on what that is. But I'll give you an example. Is I have a degree in finance, a degree in marketing, an MBA. I was a financial analyst. I was a marketing director. I was a park ranger and rose up through the ranks. So I've got operations experience there. Well, I could try to pitch all of that, but it wouldn't get me anywhere. If you go to my website, what's the one thing that I pitch? It's podcasting, which is just a small piece of what I do, but it's a good introduction to me. It's a good way in the door. It's somebody could inquire about podcasting and it turns into so much more. Let's take the work I do with Lee, for example. It started in podcasting. Then we ended up doing a course together. Then we ended up doing live events together. Now we've launched the Cockrell Academy together. But it all started with podcasting because I could say, this is what I do. This is how I can help you. It's expanded more now because now I can say, look, you had a career. Now let's build your own personal brand. Because another piece of all this is when you end your career and you start over, especially if you were an executive level, you're used to just having people do stuff for you. And you're used to having maybe an assistant or a lot of resources. And now all those positions that used to support you, you have all those positions now. And you manage your calendar and you manage your budget, all of that. And sometimes people just need a little direction. And then combine all of that with, now I have to figure out how to tell people what I offer and what I can do for them. It's not always easy when you've had a career that is a certain way and now you're out on your own. It's pretty interesting. Lee Cockrell tells a funny story of just after he retired, 40 years in the industry, and he was an executive at Marriott and then at Disney, and he retired and started his own business. And a couple months in, his wife said, Lee, I am not your assistant. Because he was just so used to asking people, hey, can you do this for me? And yeah, she only let it go for a couple of months.
Yeah. And that's an interesting piece because I've learned this lesson myself that one, there's things that I could add value, but there's a lot of things I could learn to do, but I don't do very well. And the only plus is in today's world, it's so easy to get additional help for the things that you need, but you don't know how to do or don't do well. So like I have a person who helps me with copywriting and social media posting, and I have a person who helps me with my podcast production. I could learn all those skills and be mediocre at them, but I can just, ask people. And that's what you do, is you help people either do or find these other resources that can help them stick with what they do best and not get sidetracked.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things I have done really well over the last several years is meet people. And through that, anytime I need something, I either already have someone on the team that can do it, or I know somebody. So if you were to come to me, Lynn, and say, I need to create this, or I need to do this, then I can come back and say, well, here's the 3 pieces that you need in order to accomplish that. And here's the people you want to talk to, or, hey, I've got people on my team that can cover that. Because that alone is a challenge. And I'll use Dan Cockrell as an example here. Dan is Lee Cockrell's son. He had 26 years at Disney, retired as the vice president of the Magic Kingdom, started his own business a little over 2 years ago. But then once you start and you know, okay, I need to do these things. Well, if you've had a 26-year career at Disney, you don't know where to begin when it comes to this. If maybe some people tell you, you should really start building an email list, for example. Well, if you've had a 26-year corporate career, you don't even know where to go, what program to use, how to go about it. And then even if someone tells you, oh, okay, here's the 4 steps, you need, then maybe you say, I don't even know where to begin. So just knowing people that can say, this is the steps and this is who you need to talk to and this is the program I use, that becomes very helpful.
Yeah, I can totally get that. And then I'd like to circle around to the thing that you help as you co-host shows. Again, I'm sure that takes some of the mental stress off, whether it be Lee or Dan or any of these folks. They can just do what they do best while you can kind of, ask them questions.
Yeah, that came out of when Lee and I first started doing a show together. Lee said, I want to do it, but I don't want to do Actually, I'll tell the whole story. So my first podcast is the Park Leaders Show, which is a show for park rangers. Lee was a guest twice. We really hit it off. I said, Lee, have you ever thought of having your own show? And he said, it'd be fun, but I'm retired and I want to feel retired. He was 70 at the time. He's like, I'm 70. I don't want any extra work. And I saw the opportunity and said, Lee, what if you just show up and I do all the work? And it worked really well because Lee had someone to ask him questions and pull out knowledge, and he just had to show up and be wise, which he's very good at. And that format works really well for people that have a lot of knowledge and sometimes don't know what's all there. They need someone to ask questions to bring some of it out. And it's just worked really well. That's where I ended up taking a business. Is I did the show for Lee, and then other people would reach out and say, hey, can you do for me what you did for Lee? And I've learned if you want to buy breakfast cereal for your kids, when people say, can I give you money? You say yes, as much as you can. So I started saying yes, and then just built around that. I only have 7 shows going right now. My peak has been 8 at the same time. So it's a really good format. Not only for the production side, so people don't have to worry about production. I mean, Len, you've felt the benefit of that, not having to worry about production. That's one benefit. But the other is just knowing that I've got someone by my side that's going to make me a star every week, going to make me sound great, going to always pull out my knowledge. So it works really well to have someone have a long, successful career and then kind of have, I don't know what you want to call it, a sidekick, just somebody that's always there, making them look good, bringing out their knowledge in an entertaining way for people.
Yeah, certainly, I've done a lot of solo episodes, but I've noticed, it's hard for me to think of, I'm going to sit there and share this piece of knowledge or whatever. Whereas, when I've interviewed people or interviewed others, it becomes much more natural. And while I haven't done it, I know another friend of ours, Jennifer McClure, suggested she'd come on my podcast and interview me just to help draw out the stuff that I know, but I don't think of, or I don't know how to present, at the moment.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. And I have probably 5 or 6 times been on someone else's podcast where I interview them, where they just enjoy me and say, hey, can you come on my show and interview me? Because it's the 100th episode or whatever. So it's a good way to go about it. And what I've started doing on my show, because so many of my episodes are just me, I do have a guest every month, every couple of months. It's not set, just whenever I have a guest. I have them back on the episode immediately after they're a guest, and they ask me 3 questions. And I do that for a couple of reasons, but the one I like most is it helps me see myself through the other people and what they're interested in and what has sparked their curiosity and that sort of thing. So that's one way that I've handled that is anytime there's a guest, and since I started doing it, there's been no exceptions. If you're a guest on the show, you have to ask me 3 questions on the next episode. And nobody's ever said no. I felt like there might have been a time or two, maybe they weren't enthused about it, but they've always done it. And it's been fun.
Yeah, great. Just to get into a technical detail here, again, for people that are just getting started or considering it, what's your current thinking about, how often you would podcast or the length of the show or anything? Because sometimes people feel like, I'm going to be committed to an hour or whatever it is. As I tell people, it's my show. I can do it whatever I want. But from your experience, what have you found as kind of useful?
Well, the first thing I will tell you is in podcasting, there are no rules. That's one of the great things about it. You can do whatever you want. I have episodes that are an hour long. I have episodes that are 6 minutes long. It doesn't matter. Now, I have a feeling people like regularity. They like to be used to something. So if you're just starting out and you think, oh no, I can't commit an hour every week to it, I would say, look, don't worry about it. Do once a week, 15 minutes. That's all you need to do. I like once a week. Now, it isn't necessary. You can do every other week. You can even do once a month, as long as you're regular. But I like once a week because I don't want people to forget about me. I mentioned I'm a middle child and I'm always afraid people aren't going to notice me. So I don't want you to forget about me. So I'm going to show up every week.
Yeah, the other thing, and I know you've shared and others have shared with me, the podcasting, like I have a fairly small audience, but it's a bigger audience than I'd ever reach in person normally. Even though it's considered small in the podcasting world, it doesn't have thousands or hundreds of thousands, but still it's more people I'm talking to than I normally ever would in person.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. When people say something like that, I say, well, what did you expect? Did you think you were going to start a show and it's going to be huge like Tim Ferriss or whoever who just starts a show and it's big? I actually call it the field of dreams. If you record it, he will listen. It doesn't happen that way. And if you have, let's just say you have 50 people that listen to every episode. I usually use 100 as an example, but let's use 50. Let's say you have 50 people that listen to every episode. If I went and stood on the street corner and talked and 50 people showed up, I would think I'm really on to something here. And so 50 people times 4, that's 200 people that now show up every month to listen to what you have to say. And it's really not about the numbers. It's about the connection. And here's the other thing. It's about yourself too, that if you have to show up every week and say something, you start to understand what you believe in and you start to understand how to talk about it. And you start to understand what feels right when you say it and what catches and what. So I've taken podcast episodes and made entire speeches about them. I have written articles based on either feedback I get from other people or the way it felt. Like, wait a minute, I just feel like I'm onto something. I overturned a rock that I didn't know what would be under it. And now that I found it, I really like it and I'm going to go with it. So even if the audience is small, it's still worthwhile for yourself. And I won't name names, but there's 2 podcasts I listen to or used to listen to that I stopped because they made jokes about how no one listens to the show. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm listening to the show, but it seems I'm not important enough. That's the danger in it, that a podcast host wants to think they're talking to a crowd, but a podcast listener feels like they're listening to you, like it's just you and them. And so when you treat it any other way, then you make the listener feel like, well, what about me? And it's tricky because you're behind the microphone by yourself, except moments like this where we're behind the microphone together. But when you do solo shows, you're behind the microphone by yourself. You want the feeling that you're talking to a lot of people, but you have to only talk to one person. So it's something that sometimes takes practice to get.
Yeah. And another thing, again, as I've learned, is I've gotten a series of podcasts available out there. Is people are often checking in with me after they've listened to an older show too. Most of my shows are 25 minutes, something like that. But it's rarely that I'd ever get a chance to even talk to 50 people for 25 minutes. So much less having a bunch of shows out there that people listen to, as they run across them.
Yeah. I often say the best advertisement for the episode you put out this week is the episode you put out next week. Because the more you put out, the more people will discover and they'll go back and listen to old ones. And I had a call with someone I never met. I just talked to him just like 2 weeks ago. And he was bringing up things that I was thinking, how do you even know this about me? And then he would reference that I mentioned it in an episode that to me was 2 years old. So I've forgotten about it. But to him, he just listened to it. And so it's fresh, like it just happened. That's one of the really interesting things about podcasting is people feel like they really know you, which I don't think you're going to get as a writer, but as a podcaster, when people listen regularly, they start to really feel like they know you.
Well, I'd like to also circle back on something you mentioned earlier, and that's how you've built on the podcast to actually sell other things in terms of courses or training or even books and stuff. And that would be another thing. The podcast itself may not make a lot of money, but the things you can offer after the podcast is where people might actually earn a living.
Yeah, that's right. Let's start with Lee Cockrell. We started creating Disney Magic. Then on top of that, we built an email list from scratch by offering a couple things for free. Like, hey, if you want this, come and download it. And you just have to give your email address. He already had 2 books out when we started the podcast. He now has 4. the podcast has been a big driver for book sales. He makes his living giving presentations. Of course, at the moment that's died down, but a lot of people hear him on the podcast, and we're at close to 320 episodes. I don't know, 318, I think, have been published. At 15 minutes each, that's a whole lot of Lee Cockrell where someone can listen to and say, okay, I want him to speak to our business. That's happened a lot. There's been content come from podcast episodes where we say, okay, let's turn this into something. That we did a course. The first one was Time Management Magic, and we sold it on the podcast. We sold it to the email list, and the email list started because we started promoting it on the podcast. And now we've done the Cockrell Academy, which is still fairly new. I think it's maybe 2 months old. And I think it's 7 courses now, 7 courses, and then a lot of other content that doesn't go in courses. All of that came from doing a podcast together. Plus, we do live events. We do one-day events. So it's just been the stepping stone. Now, we do have a sponsor on that particular show, but you can build all of that without making a single dollar from your podcast. Because you build a platform, you build a base of content that you can then pull from over and over again. And when you go like a book publisher, so one of my clients is Morgan James Publishing, and I know for sure one of the things they look at, if you were to come with a book proposal, one of the things they look at is the other content you've created. What have you done to get your name out there? Because they want you to be already out there before your book is available, not start getting out there once your book is available. So a podcast is a pretty good platform, and one they pay attention to because I host their podcast. I know they pay attention to podcasts. They like podcasters just like they like writers. So it's just a good way to show up every week and say, look what I've done. And then from that, you can build other things. Both of the shows I consider my own, the Park Leader Show, Jody Maberry Show, I don't have sponsors. I don't make any direct money from that, but I make indirect money and the opportunity. So here's one of my favorite podcasting stories. I started the Park Leader Show in 2014 with no audience, no email list, no social presence, to an audience that wasn't even looking for a podcast for themselves. And then in 2019, I was asked to speak at the state park directors have their own conference every year. And they invite people to come in and speak to them that would be relevant. And I was invited to speak. For a former park ranger, that is just amazing that my audience is the directors of the state park systems. And they asked me to come in and speak with some other guest speakers. The opening day lineup included the governor of Arkansas, an executive vice president of Walmart, and me. And me because of the podcast. So yeah, you can say the Park Leader Show has never directly made me any money, but look at opportunities like that have come from the podcast. So it's been just wonderful to show up every week and people eventually pay attention. The Park Leader Show had a slow start because park rangers weren't looking for it. And I didn't have an audience and I had to start from scratch. Now that show even peaked several years ago, and the listenership hasn't really gone up, but there is a very loyal fan base and they want to hear it every week. And I'm fine with that because, gosh, if the people that listen to that show were to fill a room at the same time, I would feel like I was doing pretty well.
Yeah, I was reminded of a mutual friend of ours, Mike Kim. It says marketing's not about closing a sale. It's about opening a relationship. And I think that's, clearly what you're doing through podcasting is opening relationships.
Yeah, you're right. That's exactly what it has been. And it's such a good format for people to feel like they know you. And I think these days, how important is that? Even more so than last year. I would have told you the same thing last year, but now when we're not able to get together face to face, podcasts are a great way to kind of feel like you have a relationship with somebody because, every Wednesday, Jody's going to show up and talk to me about something.
Yep. Well, thank you, Jody, for your time and all your insights and stuff. This is very helpful for me as well as my audience. Could you share some of the things that you have available? And we'll include your website on the show notes and stuff, but other things that people, where they can contact you, what they can do with you?
Well, you can find me on all the social medias. I'm everywhere you are, probably. Jody Maberry, and you can find me on the website, jodymaberry.com. And if you enjoyed listening to this, check out the Jody Maberry Show. New episode every Wednesday. We have a lot of fun with the show. I view that show as I have to be down to business for everyone else's show. But on that one, I experiment. I have a lot of fun. And sometimes the episodes don't work. Most of the time they do, but it's always a fun experiment. But check that out, the Jody Maberry Show. And if you are interested in a podcast or anything like that, you can find information on my website. And there's a guide you can download called Podcast Magic that will give you all the steps. So that alone could be enough to help you spark your ideas on how to get started on a show.
Great. Well, thanks, Jody. And I really appreciate it again. So you have a great day out there in the Northwest, and we'll shiver a little bit here in the Midwest today.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. It was great to be with you.
Again, my thanks to Jody for sharing his insights from his experience with helping other entrepreneurs share their expertise and wisdom through podcasting. Again, a quick recap. We talked about how do you have a great mindset to start this kind of an activity? How do you create your value proposition? Why would it be useful to have a co-host if you're just getting started? Getting comfortable with technology. And then at the end, Jody shared some of the things that he offers to people in terms of courses and coaching. So again, many thanks to Jody for his insights and knowledge. So what's up next on Leading the Factory Forward? We're going to continue a mix of solo episodes and interviews. And we've been having a lot of interviews recently with experts, some in manufacturing, but some in other areas that can help you build your business or help you build a solo business. So in at least one episode a month, and sometimes more, I'll be sharing my thoughts and ideas on becoming a silver entrepreneur, or how silver talent might be able to help you in your business if you're hiring something like that. And as always, I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of each podcast episode, and that'll help you start your exploration of those ideas. And to help you get started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. Again, thanks for listening, and see you next time.